from the below. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by one of our good friends, Rob Donaldson. He does such amazing work over at the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bets. We're going to be chatting with him about the fact that we've got a move in college basketball of conferences with Grand Canyon. They're going to be heading on over to the Mountain West. What can we expect out of the Mountain West this season? Can Grand Canyon be an immediate competitor there? What is the step up in competition going to be like? And so much more. And then we have to talk about the big news that we saw on Saturday in college basketball. The fact that we did have Tahaad Pettiford pick up a DUI, unfortunately, and what that's going to mean for Auburn. As of right now, we do not know what the exact suspension is going to be for him, but that said, it is going to be very interesting to see what happens there. What is going to happen with Auburn for as long as he's going to be out? How long might he be out as well? That's a big, giant question mark as well, and we're going to be talking about the structure of the SEC and just a few teams that Rob is bullish/bearish on as well, so some good fun on the podcast today. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, Larzium, maybe does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. While I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by EdgeBoost. Over at EdgeBoost, they're making sure that bettors are able to access the funds that they want to anywhere and at any time. When you do go to EdgeBoost.bet, you want to utilize that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That is going to get you a $1 match on your first deposit up to $25, and we're going to make sure that you are getting great college basketball insight every single day on this podcast with great guests like Rob Donaldson, who does a great job with his Twitter/X feed at RobDFB. When you go to youtube.com/Rob Donaldson, he does a great job with his own personal show, the Rob's Best Bets show, that is all based around baseball this time of year. And when it comes to college basketball season, he makes a change over there. And Rob, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Greg. And, right now we're in the middle of MLB All-Star break. And so it's kind of nice that we're talking about college basketball. We got to fill the time somehow. And this is one of my favorite sports to talk about. And I'm happy to be here today.
Yes, absolutely. And we've got ourselves something fun in college basketball with now the Mountain West getting stronger with Grand Canyon heading on over there. WAC pretty much just booted them out in general. What do you make out of what Grand Canyon might be able to deliver out there in the Mountain West? Because it's a step up in competition, but honestly, the travel going from the WAC to the Mountain West actually might be a little bit more tame for them as well.
Yeah, and honestly, when you look at who they've kind of been in the WAC over the last, my goodness, over a decade or at least a decade so far, they've been sort of that Gonzaga team of that league where, yeah, they are the prominent program every single year, regardless of if it's, a down year or an up year. They're usually in that 1 or 2 spot in the standings, and they're usually pushing for an automatic bid into the tournament. And I do feel like this step up was a long time coming. Hopefully, eventually we can kind of, bring these teams together for like the old school Pac-12-ish sort of feel and bring some really good teams back into the fold for that league there too. But the Mountain West, what a great get. And yeah, hot take, adding a great team is probably good for your league, and I'm glad this finally happened.
Oh, I'm right there with you. And what sort of success do you think that they're going to be able to have year number one? Because I do think that it's such an interesting landscape with a bunch of teams that I don't think are like NCAA tournament caliber, like a UNLV, for example, like a Colorado State. But those are pesky teams, and certainly those are going to be tougher games than, say, against Tarleton State and UT Arlington.
Yeah, obviously this is going to be a step up in competition right out the gates. And, for teams like that we've seen in past years kind of move up a conference in the tier, whether it was a mid-major to another mid-major, but maybe a little bit more prominent mid-major, typically it kind of withstands. Like that performance that you see year over year kind of translates. We saw this with Loyola Chicago, out the gates in the A10, it was kind of a little bit slower, but immediately after a couple years of kind of being in the middle near the bottom, they actually rose to the very top. And I do feel like when you're looking at Grand Canyon, looking at the investment in the program, this is a day one competitive team, especially when you look at the landscape of the Mountain West and some other better teams going out to the Pac-10, and also just kind of this dynamic now of coaches leaving the league as well. I feel like this league is wide open, and I think Grand Canyon has a pretty strong bid at it.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, I do think that with the Mountain West, I can't put Grand Canyon as a favorite because San Diego State, especially if Magoon Gwath is able to give them a good amount of minutes during Mountain West play, I think that they're going to be my favorite. But how do you take a look at Grand Canyon in terms of perhaps like a top three or a top five? Because I do think that San Diego State is that clear number one, but after that, I think it becomes a crapshoot.
Yeah, Brian Dutcher's squad is always going to have a really strong claim for that number one
Yes.
spot in the Mountain West. And, but you look at a team like a Boise State, for example, and, they've been very prominent as of the last 3-4 years, but they're going to be experiencing a ton of roster turnover. And today, when you're looking at the talent, when you're looking at the coaches comparatively at Boise with Rice and with Drew at Grand Canyon, I feel like Grand Canyon might actually have an edge right out the gate. And Boise is one of those teams kind of being thrown in the mix for a potential claim at that top spot in the Mountain West. So if you're asking me, top five, top three, I feel like top five is actually conservatively accurate, and I think there's a real good chance that they're going to make a claim for that top three or top two spot right there in year one.
Yes, I do think that it's going to be a lot of fun for Grand Canyon, and not a lot of people are talking about this. What do you make out of the WAC now, and who might be able to win that conference? Because I mean, Grand Canyon was very clearly head and shoulders that number one team. Now it's anyone's guess as to who's going to be able to win that conference.
Yeah, and unfortunately for the WAC over the years, man, they have been getting absolutely picked apart. It's just the nature
And they
of,
kicked him out this year. Like the WAC could have kept him, but they kicked him out.
I think it's because to some degree on the back end of negotiations, obviously something wasn't aligning. And when you look at the investment measures that Grand Canyon is taking, you got to kind of think that maybe Grand Canyon almost force their hands to kick them out or make a stronger offer than what they could potentially offer. And I think that's what, ended this relationship of sorts. And yeah, when you look at the WAC, my goodness, it's like 8 teams remaining. This used to have 12 teams in it just a couple of years ago is what it felt like. And right now, when you look at the landscape, Utah Valley is obviously the one team that you kind of default to because they've been the Grand Canyon rivalry in that conference, and I really want to see that rivalry continue. It's one of my favorites in all the mid-major ranks, but I think when you look at them, you look at Abilene Christian's been kind of going through it after some coaching turnover and some roster turnover to a mega degree, and I really don't even know what to make of this league anymore. I feel like this needs to kind of almost dissolve and be filling up other conferences because as a standalone conference, it's almost a crapshoot at this point.
Oh, yes, it certainly is. And I'm here for the crapshoot, to say the least, because at the very least, we're going to be able to make money on the crapshoot and trying to be able to tell who's going to be able to rise up in that conference. As joining me on the show, we do have one of our good friends, Rob Donaldson of the Rob's Best Bet Show, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I mean, out there in the WAC, it is going to be interesting to see what we get there. And just how do you take a look at mid-major basketball in general out west? Because the Mountain West gets stronger, and I still feel like the Big West is going to be a rock-solid conference as well. But the Big Sky and the WAC, which the WAC, they call it the Western Athletic Conference, but they've got more teams in Texas, I would say, than they have actually on the West Coast. So that's going to be interesting. But I think that they now just fall a step behind the Big West, whereas they might have been a little bit more on par with them last season.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is the Texas-Utah coalition of sorts, if you will. And I really don't know if that really describes any other league where you really have 2 states and then randomly California Baptist is in there. Again, this is just one of those leagues right now that just kind of feels like it's lost in the void of these conference realignments, which personally I hate. I kind of like that there were all these little pockets of really fun basketball on a night-to-night basis being played, and some of it just felt completely disconnected from the rest of the college basketball world. But we are moving towards a model in college basketball and college sports in general right now where everything blends together into some degree. And I do feel like when you're looking at mid-major basketball, just in general, not even out in the West, I think we're seeing a really strong impact of conference realignment. And we're seeing coaches kind of make it really pronounced that, yeah, I'm not really trying to build anything anymore at these mid-major levels. I'm trying to make the bag because all my players are trying to make the bag. And what's really to build if you can't retain your guys.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there and not being able to retain their guys. That is a big issue for them, and Auburn has a big issue on their hands as well, as Tahaad Pettiford, who was really their top returning guy from a season ago, he picked up a DUI over the weekend. We have to talk about what might be happening with this situation. We have yet to find out what the exact suspension is going to be for Auburn. We're going to be talking about what might be happening for them, while the offense and the team is going to be looking for, as long as Auburn is going to have Tahaad Pettiford out of the fold, if that's going to be any games whatsoever. And then we have to take a look at a few teams that our good friend Rob is a bit bullish/bearish on as well. That comes up next right here on Critical Seats with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast. And we're back in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Soups with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. We're rejoined by Rob Donaldson, who does such amazing work over at the Rob's Best Bets Show. You go to youtube.com/Rob Donaldson. He's doing amazing work over there, and we were leaving off talking about what we've all got out of Grand Canyon, the WAC, and the fact that there's going to be some gains and losses out there. How about if we do talk about a loss for Auburn and the fact that Tahaad Pettiford coming back to school was absolutely massive for them. Bad news is it appears as though they're not going to have him out there night number one, as he got a DUI for Auburn, and I think that leads to the question of how long can we expect him to be out for, because I still go back to the Mark Few suspension when he got a DUI a few years ago. It was for like 2 exhibition games and a game number one of the season where they were like a 40-point favorite, and it was Big Giant Nothing Burger. But student versus coach, I think it's one thing as well, and I think that this is going to be very much something to monitor here in the next few days and few weeks.
Yeah, and as we've known about kind of these types of charges or arrests in the past, it can be a varied, different sort of suspension kind of that is levied on the player. We saw in college football Mike Gundy go out and defend Ollie Gordon at running back and basically say, oh, well, I've driven drunk hundreds of times, or that drunk hundreds of times, and then just kind of poo-poo it, and Ollie Gordon played the entire season. So who knows really what's going to come about with a suspension, but certainly not what you want to see in the offseason from your star guy who is underage. You're a prominent program at this point. You're consistently winning in the SEC, and you're a team that needs to get over the hump. And this just kind of feels like it's a setback for no good reason. And I do wonder how that affects the morale of a locker room when that happens. And I do wonder, what the punishment is going to potentially be on a star player, and how, again, that residual impact not only affects the play on the court, but how these players sort of gel together early in the season. It's definitely something to monitor, and I don't think it's just a nothing burger. I think it's going to end up, potentially just playing out in a number of that we just kind of have to monitor at this point.
Yes, absolutely. And it is going to be interesting to see how long Auburn might be without him, because I feel like Tahaad Pettiford might be one of the most impactful players to his respective teams in all of college basketball, because he decides to come back. And for Auburn, I didn't know what they were going to be doing in the backcourt without him. And now without him in the fold, you really don't have too much of a point guard for this team with any sort of NCAA experience. And I think that this is going to be a big deal for Auburn moving forward.
Yeah, when you watch a lot of their games last season when they were, getting dogged by Florida or kind of getting their rougher games, it was when they couldn't make shots from the perimeter, because they always had Johni Broome, but, Johni Broome was leaving the floor ever so often, because when you're a big, you're kind of susceptible to getting hit around and jumping and landing on feet and having that more higher propensity for injury. And you need that steadiness at guard, not only when you have your big guys available, but when they aren't. And if you don't have that big guy, because he's gone to the NBA draft, and you have guys leaving for USC, and now you have guys in your own locker room that were that continuity factor not being on the court for these types of reasons, all of a sudden you have this ultimate wild card of roster turnover by a million different reasons. And I do feel like that's going to end up playing a massive factor for Auburn if they can't get it together.
Yes, no question about it, as it's going to be so fascinating to see what we get with regards to Auburn, because, out there in a brutal SEC, I would not think that Tahaad Pettiford would be suspended for an entire season or anything like that, but I feel like with Auburn, they're going to need to pick up every win that they can in non-conference play because it's looking like it's going to be another rough year out there in the SEC. And whereas Auburn was that top two team in the SEC going into the season last year, they're just not quite on par with that this season. And I do think that if they slip up a game or two in the non-conference portion of the season without Pettiford, that could be a really big blow for them in terms of seeding.
Yeah, and we kind of had talked about it all offseason, but, the building point of a program at this point and your window of opportunity to win a championship isn't that 4-year stretch where you bring in that star freshman who just hangs on to the program. You're able to hone his skill set. You're able to maybe add a transfer along the way. And all of a sudden, after 4 years of building, you have this continuity roster that you built throughout the program. That's no longer the actual realistic dream to have. You have these 2-year windows, and they had their 2-year window with Janai Broome. Obviously, it didn't come to fruition the way that they would have liked it to come to fruition. And now they're kind of in that next transition phase of, did they add enough? I don't think they did. I think that they're relying a lot of guys from last year to get better, as well as, some transfers, not only to perform to how they were performing last year at their previous stop, but to get better in this window that is probably only going to last for maybe 1 or 2 years. I don't know if Auburn is necessarily leaving themselves in a good spot right here. And unfortunately, in the college basketball landscape, you have these little pockets of windows and they're shorter than ever. And yeah, these are really massive setbacks that can take a hit on those windows.
Yep, these are big giant setbacks, and even though Tahaad Pettiford might play much of the season, he might be dealing with some things off the court to take him out of the practice floor and everything like that. So that is certainly going to be affecting chemistry towards the beginning part of the season as well. As joining me on the show, we do have our good friend Rob Donaldson of the Rob's Best Bets show joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And certainly those are the two biggest things happening in college basketball right now. As we are at a little bit of slow period. We're right now also dealing with the All-Star break in baseball, so it truly is a slow period on so many different fronts. But how do you take a look at college basketball right now this time of year in terms of trying to identify teams that might have value for the upcoming season?
When you're going through all these mid-major teams, and I start with the higher majors because they're collecting the talent off the top, and they are keeping the players. And if they don't enter the portal right away, you can kind of have an idea of what their rosters more so look like for the upcoming season as opposed to these mid-majors. But when you start diving into these mid-majors, man, it's almost a little bit depressing, Greg. I'm going to be honest, because you see teams like Troy that last year came out of nowhere, and that was that kind of tippy top of that 2 to 3 year window. And every single good player that Troy had in their possession last season either graduated or is at a different school now. And it's one of those dynamics of the mid-major ranks right now where if you're not in the A10 or the Mountain West or kind of the American or one of these more top 10 mid-majors, you're subtracting players. You're not, gaining from the down transfers and then gaining from the mid-major teams below you. You're losing and maybe getting some down transfers to your level, but those down transfers kind of have to skip a couple levels to get to your school. And so when you look at the Sun Belt, for example, this is a league that I look at and, oh my goodness, they were ravaged. And I know that it's going to be producing fun basketball throughout the regular season, but once it gets into those sort of out-of-conference opponents against, these high major schools or in the NCAA tournament or in the NIT or whatever postseason tournament comes about, I don't know if I want to be back in the Sun Belt just because I know what the talent accumulation and the talent loss was like in the offseason.
Yep, I think that is so well said by you. These guys that are going to be transferring downward. Now, some of these guys that actually go from the D2 ranks to the D1 ranks are guys that are pretty rock solid as well, but I also do think that with mid-majors, they're the biggest roll of the dice because you just don't know what you're going to be able to get out of these power conference guys where some of them are absolutely amazing. I take a look at some of these guys, like, for example, we're going to throw out there Braden Podziemski, who goes on over from Illinois to Santa Clara. That worked out as well as humanly possible for Santa Clara. And then there's other guys that average maybe 3 points per game at insert your fun Big Ten school here. And then they average 2 points per game at the Coastal Conference. And that's what makes things so difficult, in my opinion, when it comes to evaluating these mid-majors during the offseason.
The whole kind of thing about mid-majors right now is roster turnover, which can be good. It can really elevate a school out of the absolute doldrums and into relevance within 1 year and with one good coaching hire. that's an actual promising, goal to have, an aspiration. You don't have to sit at the bottom if you're like a UL Monroe, for example, that's been absolutely terrible for as long as I can remember at this point. You can make the right hire. You can have the splash recruits that all of a sudden just all pan out, all gel together, and you can run the Sun Belt out of nowhere. Like, that's a realistic thing that can happen now. Now, you also are going to have those mid-majors like the Gonzagas, the Grand Canyons, the San Diego States, High Point, VCU. There's a lot of these mid-major schools that are always going to be prominent because the investment is there, relevant to that level. But when you are looking at the totality of these leagues, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity, but I also feel like there's just a lot of savagery of picking these teams apart. And it's almost unfortunate that we don't get that continuity year over year over year like we did before the transfer portal and the NIL and conference realignment really took over this sport.
Yep, that is so unfortunate because it has been hurting a lot of these mid-major schools. Some of them have been able to benefit. I will say the Big West, it does feel like they're in a better spot now than really ever before,
Yes.
but there are so many others that, well, they have not been benefiting, to say the least, and we always benefit by having you aboard, Rob, and I do want to get your thoughts on this as well. Has there been a team or two that you've been evaluating over the last few weeks that you're starting to feel a little bit more bullish on them, and you're starting to feel a little bit better about their prospects for the upcoming season?
Like, not even like with intent. I have made a lot of topic of conversation about the Sun Belt in this episode for whatever reason. And that's because I think partially because I've been diving into the Sun Belt, kind of looking at who I want to target. And Preston Spradlin and James Madison, Preston Spradlin came over from Morehead State 2 years ago, or I guess last season was his first season at James Madison. And he was filling some really big shoes, and I thought he did extremely well. Yes, did he lose some pieces to some higher major schools? For sure. But did he attract a lot of not only down transfers, but up transfers to his program? I would say yes. And again, in a landscape of the Sun Belt where you're losing head coaches, you're losing a bunch of players, James Madison almost feels like they got better potentially, and that's a huge asterisk question mark, but I feel like they have a lot of the most promise in this league, and if you're throwing out futures, if you're looking just by a game-by-game betting standpoint right out the gate, I think James Madison could be back to form where they were, just a couple years ago.
And the irony of it all coming back to the Sun Belt, I absolutely love, as I do agree with you on James Madison. They were a little bit rough to begin the season last year, caught some steam towards back half of it, and we always catch steam when you're aboard, Rob. You do such an incredible job taking a look at this great game of college basketball, so love to get people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Well, hey, Greg, I always love talking ball with you, especially now that we're sitting in July and waiting for these games to just actually get into the fold. But, for those who are wanting to follow my college basketball bets once that comes around, you can do so on Twitter/X at RobDFB and also on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Rob Donaldson. But as always, Greg, I appreciate having me on, man.
And I always appreciate Rob being aboard. He does such an incredible job taking a look at this great game of college basketball. And every single time he joins me, learns such great insight. So big thanks to Rob for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, the naming does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. I am coming at you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season, rain or shine, it does not matter. I'm going to be here, and I will be catching you guys once again tomorrow. Thank you so much.